Kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of Big Hairy News. Dunedin, and my dog's just in the room, Mia Aaron Hawkins, so I'll just get rid of her. Hey, out you go. Well, come here. Come and say hello. Come here. Come here. Up. So here's the dog. Right, you go away. Go on, off you go. Good girl. Hello, Aaron. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the episode. Kia ora. You doing well?
Yeah, very good, thank you. The sun's just broken out here, which is nice.
Yeah. Been up to much today?
Was it down at the stadium earlier for the Moana Nui festival, which is now an annual festival celebrating the song and dance and, most importantly, food of our Pacifica communities. It was a good time.
Didn't even know that was on. First question there, Bill, and actually I thought of this question when I was at an event a few weeks ago that you were at for children getting awards in the science world, like school children receiving science awards.
Oh, the science and technology fair.
Sure. As you'll appreciate, parents get about 1,000 different things labeled coming across their doorstep. I never know what they're called, but it was a science award thingy that you were a part of to give out awards. And I thought there and then, my first question, or one of my questions, which works now because you've just been to another thing, is that as the current mayor, as the incumbent mayor, do you get an unfair advantage of publicity and exposure at this time of year when you're going into election cycle? Because you're at these events being seen by people like none of the other candidates were at that event handing out science awards. You were. Is that a bit of a, you can look at it either way. You can look at it as a happy advantage or an unfair advantage or a perk of the job or whatever. Is that something that happens that to the mayor that's just sort of goes with the territory? Or does your public appearance to do with that sort of thing ramp back a little bit when you're in election cycle?
I think it's certainly true that whichever race you're in, incumbency is a significant advantage, whether you're running for re-election to the city council or whether you're running for re-election as mayor, and there's no point pretending that isn't the case. But I have a job to do, and that job continues on until October, and it would be unfair on the community if I stopped doing what they were paying me to do in the interim because we're in the middle of a campaign. So that's just the nature of the beast, really.
Yeah, I was thinking that because like the voting papers went out, I think last Friday, so most people would have had them by this week. I was just wondering if there's a rule that should come in that maybe once papers are out there, that maybe work for councillors and mayors should stop and electioneering should be. So it's a little 2-week window of that sort of the focus. I'm just not talking about what happens in the chamber. I mean, the thing can't shut up, but just public appearances. It was just a thought that I went, there's an advantage that you get as incumbent, or any incumbent, not just you personally, any incumbent that others don't get.
And it's certainly different to how Parliament operates, right? So there's a point at which the Prime Minister becomes the leader of X party or the leader of Y party, and ministers stop functioning as ministers during that period. But that isn't the way local government is structured. Yeah.
Cool, man. Hey, listen, I want to get into some questions about lots of different issues of the day. We've also got people who have been submitting questions in the last kind of 24 hours. But as we're talking about you and your role, I'd like to start by talking to you about your leadership style. Your leadership style has come under criticism by several, whether those are valid criticisms or whether those are people with an agenda or whatever, I don't know, but it has come under criticism. I've brought up a couple of articles here from the ODT, one from November 2021, where you were criticised, your leadership style was criticised by both Councillor O'Malley, and let me bring this up so people can see it, where he said that the senior councillor's frustration had grown in the past year and it seemed to take issue with the flippant snippets Mr. Hawkins sometimes offered at meetings. I'm making a stand against poor leadership characterised by sarcasm worthy of worst school-age child, Councillor O'Malley said. Also, I think in that article, the chairman of the ORC had some criticisms as well, but also, and Councillor Sophie Barker, who I've spoken to, and she talked about this when we had the episode. She thinks that, and I guess I'm paraphrasing, that sort of the buck for how the council works or doesn't work, the people in council, the councillors, the way they're cohesive or not. These are my words, not hers, but this is the vibe I got. The buck stops with the mayor. And she says, Councillor Barker said that she believes voters want change and to feel like they're being listened to. The Otago Daily Times asked Councillor Barker what she meant, giving her voting record in the past was similar to that of Mr. Hawkins. She pointed to the leadership style and said the council did not appear to be cohesive enough. Does the community trust the council, was the question she asked. The challenge is working towards more of a culture of respect and trust. Councillor Barker summarised her candidacy as being about rebuilding trust and her being an independent people person. She was not convinced the strengths of some of the councillors had been harnessed well enough under Mr. Hawkins and suggested the council needed to be more focused on implementing its strategies. Talk to me about your leadership style, and I'd like you to respond to that. Are there any fair criticisms there as to how the councillors have been operating under you?
I think that there being disagreement around the council table, particularly when we're dealing with significant issues, is a feature and not a bug of the system. You know, we are elected by a community who hold very different views, and so you would expect that sitting around the table, that elected members will take different positions and sometimes quite strongly take different positions on issues, and that can often be characterized by some as being divisive or dysfunctional, but I can't see how, because there will never be a point, I don't think, and you wouldn't want to get to a point where everyone agreed on everything, because that wouldn't be reflective of the community that we represent. The job of the mayor as chair of council is to make sure that all of those opinions and all of those views have the opportunity to be heard and to participate in the debate, and to be and for that to be done in a collegial and a constructive manner. And I think I've done that over the last 3 years. It's not always perfect, and I know there are always going to be different approaches to running meetings, but I think by and large we've allowed for people to be able to participate in the debate, and that is the job of the chair of the meeting.
So would you say that criticism is unwarranted then?
I think the criticism is vague, and so until you're dealing with specifics, it's hard to respond to vague accusations.
Sure.
And similar things have come up previously where people have tried to talk about bullying within council, and it's really hard to respond to things unless people give you concrete examples to deal with.
And I could be wrong here, because I could be buying into the appearance of something rather than the reality of something, but you do appear to be, and the word in my head is a divisive character. I don't want to use that word because it implies that you're doing something. So I guess the way I'm wording it is a personality that divides the community quite strongly. Like, people either sort of love you or on board, or they don't. It's a black or a white. No criticism on that, but that's the perception I get from being out there. And I was thinking, when it comes to the cohesion of a team working around you, first of all, is that observation fair? And second of all, if it is, how does that person, I think about council as a team and the mayor sort of being the team leader, for want of a better way of doing it.
Sure.
If it is either a sort of black, white, love, hate, hot, cold sort of relationship, if that's who you are, how does that give those of us who are voters and ratepayers and citizens or residents of Dunedin sort of comfort for a well-functioning council chamber?
I don't know about the team analogy, because I don't think it is. I mean, because in a team or in a corporate board or governance structure, you make the assumption that everyone that is involved in that team or sitting around that board table is trying to achieve the same thing. That they have shared values and shared aspirations and a shared vision. And in politics, that's not going to be the case. You have people who have competing aspirations and competing values and competing priorities, and the forum we have is council for people to make their case on behalf of their community, and on any given day, if 7 or more people agree with you, then that becomes the direction that we take. So,
Right.
I think it's a little, and that will always be. But the question really is how. I think how you create or how you run an environment that lets people be able to participate more than trying to chase, unanimous support for any particular direction that council might be heading on. I don't think it's is it polarizing? Is it divisive? I mean, I think I've been quite good previously on council and similarly as mayor at building fairly broad political support for what we're trying to achieve. It doesn't get much more Labour than David Benson Pope, and they don't come much bluer than Mike Lord, and yet we work together on big issues that are facing the city to get the best outcome for Dunedin. So I don't think it's necessarily tribal or partisan. I think we are certainly trying to we are making significant decisions in the city in terms of which direction we're going to go down, and they are always going to be contentious. And I appreciate that, as the champion of that and as the leader of council, I am a lightning rod for that. But I think it's more about what we are trying to do than it is the people who are trying to do it.
I hear what you're saying about the team thing. It's fair. It's a fair point. Not that I need to have a counterpoint with you, Aaron, but I guess what I'm thinking is, like, if I'm watching the All Blacks tomorrow night beat Australia, fingers crossed, within that team, there may be different philosophies as to how to best play. Like, is it going to be an attack-based game? Is it going to be a defense-based game? So within a team, you may have different philosophies and ideas how to best move forward, but you still need to work as a team. So I think you can see it both ways. I think it still can be thought about as a team, even if people have different objectives in there. I think the objective in the team is overall the win. Maybe that's where your point is valid, but I also think you can have a team with differing perspectives and opinions on what would be best. What would be best in that situation.
I'm just thinking this may not be the best season to be having this kind of making this analogy, but you would think though that going out onto the pitch for the beginning of the match, that the team would have coalesced around a particular strategy or a particular approach, regardless of whether they, and maybe they haven't this year, and maybe that's the problem. But
well, they're about to win the rugby championship, I hope, tomorrow night. So maybe, as much as we've been complaining about them, it might still pull one out of the bag. Hey, let me just ask you this again. This is the also on the same theme as what we're talking about. I want to actually get you to describe what your leadership style is, because I had a conversation with one particular mayoralty candidate last week, and he said to me that the process of getting policy through required a, quote, great amount of bullying to make sure there is enough voters there in the council to rubber stamp it, end quote. And then he went on to say, quote, teamwork in politics is a myth. So that was another candidate's position on what their leadership style would be. Obviously, they don't believe in teamwork, and they think you need to be a bully to get policy through. I'd be interested to know, how would you describe yourself as a team leader, as the mayor? What's your leadership style? How would you describe your leadership style?
I think I don't quite agree with Councillor Vandervis around having to bully things through, but our job we are governors, and our job is to set strategy and policy and budgets, and then we delegate to the chief executive and their staff the job of implementing what we are setting out to achieve, and then monitoring that performance. And the job of the mayor within a governance arrangement is to create an environment at the council table where people are able to participate in that debate and contribute to that debate and be heard on behalf of their communities. And then council makes its decision, and then the job is to be the spokesperson and the champion for the positions of council, regardless of what my individual views may have been going into a debate. We make collective decisions. Those are the positions of council, whether it's explaining that to our community or presenting our views to a select committee. That is the job. You are the spokesperson of the collective view, and you are, as the chair of the meeting, responsible for creating an environment where people are able to participate equally and collegially in arriving at those positions.
Mm-hmm. So did you actually explain to us there what your personal leadership style is? That's what I'd be interested to know as well. Like, are you a push through kind of person? Are you a collaborator? Are you trying to get people on board? How would you describe it?
I think with leadership it depends on circumstance. So
Yep.
sometimes the best thing to do is to be leading a campaign and out on the streets, and we've done that. We've run campaigns to save the courthouse building here in Dunedin. We've run campaigns to have the hospital rebuilt, and those are understandable. That is a particular style that works in those circumstances. Sometimes it's best to make room for other people and allow them to be heard and try and come to consensus-based decisions. Sometimes the best thing to do for leadership is sitting quiet and saying nothing in the short term, even though people can be quite agitated by that, because for example, to use a recent example, we applied for consent to get a landfill developed in Smooth Hill as per a historic designation there. That was subject to a statutory process, and so the best thing from a leadership point of view to do in that process is to say nothing, and that's difficult for politicians at any point, saying nothing, particularly when people in the community are quite agitated about things. But there was nothing. There was no value to be had in us wading in on that process just to feel like we were responding to community pressure. The best thing to do was to sit down and say nothing and let that process run its course. So, it's about taking the approach that best suits the situation that you're in, as opposed to having any kind of blanket style,
Right.
regardless.
So you're saying that it depends on the circumstance as to how you lead in that particular moment. So got it. Again, just talking about Sophie Barker, because I talked to her earlier, and it's to do again with council. And I asked you, and I'd be interested actually if we didn't quite address this: is the mayor the buck stopper? Does the buck stop with the mayor as to the culture and interpersonal relationship of how the councils work and how they work with each other? I'm talking about within the council chamber. Ultimately, is it the mayor's ultimate responsibility as to how that functions? Those people in that room, is that ultimately the mayor's responsibility, in your opinion?
I think everyone who works in that room and in that environment needs to accept some responsibility for how they conduct themselves and how they go about it, and how they contribute to the work that we do. I mean,
I agree. Sorry, I'm not trying to cut you off, Aaron, but because we've got a lot to get through. I'm going like the ultimate, like, you hear a business and the CEO will go like, ultimately the buck rests with me with what happens down there with our entry level work. So ultimately the buck rests with me. I'm wanting to know is ultimately, do you think, does the buck rest with the mayor as to how that council chamber functions, the people in the council chamber? I agree with you that everyone has their own part to play, but ultimately, does it rest with the mayor?
Certainly, in terms of how the meetings function and how we run the governance arm of council, I think that is the responsibility of the chair of the meeting. How people conduct themselves in and around that, I don't think it's reasonable to expect the mayor to take ownership of that.
The reason I asked that question is, as I said, Sophie Barker, she has said in the conversation I had with her that this is the most toxic environment she has ever worked in. She was talking about the current council. Now, I don't want you necessarily to speak to how she feels, because that's her thing, but I wanted to know from you, as the mayor, how much of the responsibility of the culture of that toxicity rests with you. And I'm not even accusing you of being toxic. I'm saying of the responsibility of the mayor to control what goes on there. How much are you responsible for that? And I'll say alleged toxic culture.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had over this term, over the last 3 years, in terms of how the governance arm functions, is that there are we have elected members who fundamentally disagree with the concept of collective responsibility and decision making, and will either misrepresent or have misrepresented decisions that council have made, and I know you've traversed this in earlier conversations, have sought to actively undermine and white ant the decisions that council has made. And when you're operating in an environment where people are comfortable doing that, and behave in that way as a point of pride almost, it makes it pretty difficult from a leadership point of view to try and manage that, and it's up to them to answer as to why they're comfortable doing that and behaving in that way. But it does make trying to form a coherent voice around council difficult.
So is what you're saying the answer to how much of that toxic relationship environment, is the mayor responsible? Is your answer to that sounds like it's none, no responsibility at all, unless that mayor happened to be contributing to it.
Oh, I wouldn't say none. I think there's certainly a role. There's an important role for the mayor to play in how they conduct themselves in meetings, and how they conduct themselves in giving effect to the decisions of council, and how we work together and how we arrive at those positions is absolutely important in terms of the culture of the governing body. So I don't think it's none, and I don't think it's everything, but I do think that there are. We operate in a political environment, right? And people are trying to achieve different things, and that is sometimes going to express itself in ways that aren't necessarily as constructive as they might be.
People, if you are watching live, have an opportunity to submit a question. All you got to do is write it in the comments. If you're watching us on Facebook, you have to accept some terms and conditions to ask a question with your name. If you don't want to accept those terms and conditions, just write your name at the end of the question. And I'm not saying all of them will get used, but I will sift through them. And if we're not going to cover them off, or they're interesting questions, I'm happy to pass them on to Mayor Aaron Hawkins as well. There is a question that came onto the Facebook page, one of the Facebook pages earlier, and it's to do with your affiliation with the Green Party. And I'd like to follow that a little bit. But the first question about that is, why not? Why aren't you running for council? You're running for mayor only. Why is that?
Because this is the job that I'm currently doing, and it's the job that I'm asking for the support of the community to keep doing for another 3 years. And I don't think it would be fair, and it's relevant to the last conversation, really. I don't think it would be fair to the incoming mayor were I to arrive and be sitting around the council table. I think they deserve a clean shot at trying to implement what they want to achieve for the community without the ghosts of mayoralty past sitting there.
But that's not a rule, is it? You're just making that choice.
No, and mayors not too far from here, I understand, are running for both mayor and council. But it's my choice. I could have chosen to.
So I know you probably won't want to answer this question because it sounds a bit defeatist, but if you don't win the mayoralty, then what?
I've got 7 days to figure that out, Pat.
What happens actually after, like if you don't win, right? What happens to your paycheck? You get paid to the end of the year?
7 days. 7 days.
That's it. So if you don't win, then you're done in 7 days. The pay stops everything. You're out on your ear, and that's it.
Yeah, and I will move out of my office before the 8th of October. And we'll see what happens on the 8th of October, and on Monday we'll plan accordingly. So
this relates to Robin Broughton's question off a Facebook page as well, to do with the Green Party, because I thought about this just yesterday whilst I was standing at my washing machine. I don't know why it came up to me then, Aaron, but I just wondered, if not the mayoralty, does that mean Green Party list MP in 12 months from now living in Dunedin?
I don't have a huge interest in being a member of Parliament. I have a 6-year-old son, and the idea of going to work on a Monday morning and coming home from work on a Thursday night holds very little appeal to me at this stage in my life, which isn't never say never, but it doesn't hold a great deal of interest for me at this point.
Because I guess I was wondering, and actually as I wondered that, I have heard echoed from some other people as well, whether mayoralty was plan A and Parliament was plan B, or perhaps, which would be terrible, Parliament was plan A, but if you can't get in there, mayoralty could be plan B, which obviously would be a terrible situation because the person wouldn't be there for the focus. But you're saying no chance, no focus, no idea, no thought, should you not win, of being on the Green Party list in 12 months from now?
It's certainly not something that appeals to me, and I have never run for Parliament. I've never stood for the Green Party list. I've only ever run for election in the Dunedin City Council elections.
Does it frustrate you that so many people want to talk about fucking parking, when it comes to mayoralty elections. Like, I think about what could be done, but like I want to talk about parking, but does it frustrate you that for some people that seems to almost be their number one issue?
I'm not. It's not my job to second guess what's important to people, And if that is a concern, then that's fine. I guess our job is to try and elevate the conversation to think about things a little more broadly and a little more holistically, and and let's talk about a transport network as opposed to let's talk about car parking, because then you get to have a discussion about what's important to us and how we might set the city up for the future, as opposed to operating at a very micro level, which is understandable, because those are the it's potholes and car parks and those sort of specific things that that do agitate people. But our job as governors is to think about things a little more broadly and a little more strategically than that.
Because I wonder as well, and let's talk about the pedestrianisation of George Street. Yeah, I wonder as well about
what pedestrianisation of George Street, though?
Well, that's what I want to talk about. Because this is what we've talked about with everyone about the proposed pedestrianisation. Well, do you want to open it up by telling us what's going on there? Because it sounds like you've had a very different response from everyone else who wanted to have an opinion on this. But what I was going to say before you do, I was going to say, like, for this kind of idea, for me personally, I think about going along to, I don't know, one of the shops there and wanting to park outside, which is great. But I also think about going down there and hanging out as a pedestrian, and that sounds great. It sounds like, for me, I'm a bit ambivalent to it, and I'm sure if I wanted to duck into Harvey Norman or whatever that shop's called there, and I couldn't, I'd be like, oh, car parks. And if I wanted to sit there for a coffee or something, I'd be like, isn't this amazing? And I guess you've responded to it interestingly before we even started. So I guess before we do, what's happening with George Street, the pedestrianisation of it, the one-waying of it, and the 10-kilometre-hour speed zone? What have you suggested with that comment you just made?
Oh, just that pedestrianisation means a particular thing, and that's not what we're planning on doing in the main street. So there will still be. It is still a road that is open to.
All right. So are you okay? So the one-wayingness, the single lane 10-kilometre one. We'll call it whatever we want, but that's what we wanted to talk about. And as I said, I'm sure for me, if I went down and I wanted to duck in and get something from a shop, it'd annoy me that I couldn't park as easily. And for the times I wanted to go there for a coffee, I'd be like, this is the greatest thing in the world. What I was going to say about ideology versus practicality is that it seems that the examples that some are using to show how fantastic this could be are places like San Francisco and places like Melbourne and those sorts of places, which look fantastic, but obviously have a very different climate to what we've got here in Dunedin. And so I guess one of the criticisms is this sort of idea seems to work better in a more temperate or warmer climate than it does in a place like Dunedin. What would we use it for? What are the rationale and reasons behind wanting to do this? And where are we at with it right now?
So this has been a 10-year process, give or take, in having this conversation about how we want our city centre to function, and whether we want our main street to be a thoroughfare or a destination. How do we invest in it in a way that makes it vibrant, that makes it accessible, that makes it inclusive? I mean, you'll see there's one. There are still car parking spaces. They're not being stripped out of that area. The design and the layout we landed on is effectively a compromise. There were plenty of people who did want us to shut the street off entirely and to remove traffic from it, and others who wanted the status quo. And we've landed on a position where we have one-way traffic, significantly more public space for people to be in, maintaining most of the car parking through there actually, but prioritizing that for people who have mobility. So, prioritizing mobility parking and short-term parking, because those are the people in our community who actually do have a legitimate need to be closer to their destination than people like me who can probably, should walk a few more blocks. And it would probably do me the world of good to do that. And so this is the work we're doing. The catalyst for it is that we've got ancient underwater infrastructure that needs upgrading in a planned way, as opposed to waiting for things to erupt in the middle of the street. And we've seen in Wellington how disruptive that can be. And if you're going to do all of that work, then why would you put it back the way that you found it, as opposed to looking at how we might be able to create an environment that is more people friendly, that is therefore more business friendly. I've got a great message from from someone a week or two ago saying that it looked great as a wheelchair user. She was going to be able to finally be able to come back to the city centre. And if you think about that, we have made conscious decisions that have excluded that person from being able to come into the city centre and enjoy the heart of the city. And those are the sorts of things that we're finally trying to address in doing the work that we're currently doing in George Street.
Quite a specific question, because no one's been able to answer it for me yet. For the section that is going to be turned into a one-way, how many car parks are we actually losing? Because there are car parks, you're right, because every time I show that, I point out, oh, look, there's cars parking there. Like, do you know how many actual car parks are going to be gone from that section that's now a one-way?
Not off the top of my head, but it's not significant. But
what, half, a quarter, a third, like estimation then?
Oh, in terms of what it will be relative to what it currently is?
Yeah, like ish. Give me an ish.
Oh, I mean, it'll be 3/4 of current at least.
So the capacity will be 3/4 of the current, not losing 3/4.
But the spaces will function differently because the resources being prioritized differently. But it's not a significant overall quantum change.
Someone on Facebook also wants to know, has there been any, I'm wording the question that they've put a bit differently, but has there been any conversations in council, like projections as to what will happen with business, i.e. will this ultimately help businesses there, harm businesses there, and what are the repercussions if it, like, let's say this takes another few years to get done. Let's say let's say you're not there. And if this actually is a complete balls up and it doesn't work for businesses, then what? Have those conversations happened in the chamber at all?
I think it's important to acknowledge that the built environment alone isn't going to give us a vibrant city centre. You need to do a lot of work around that, and that's things like events and activating the space and having people use it and doing things in the city centre that bring people in. So that will be a focus once the work is done. It's also worth noting, I think, that when we were going through this decision-making process, there were a number of people who were involved in giving advice, no shortage of advice on something like this. And the decision that council ultimately made was supported by the then Chamber of Commerce's Retail Committee Chair. And that is a person who knows far more about how retail environments function than I ever will. And I think that should give people some comfort that people who understand how public space can contribute to business vitality and therefore economic vitality have supported the decisions that we've made, but we will certainly need to bring the space to life, if you like, and to find ways of encouraging people to do it. But the nature of retail is changing. No one's going to pretend that it isn't, or that we can turn that around. And one of the interesting comments that we had from a property developer that came to speak to us at Public Forum once was that they talked about the concept of high quality public space being the new anchor tenant for successful city centres. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. If you create an environment that people want to come to and want to spend time in, and yes, there's always going to be days where the southerly rips through and nobody's going to be there, but that's not a reason to not create an environment where, weather permitting, people will want to come and spend time and have opportunities to just sit and be in the space. Certainly having a small child made me think very differently about how our cities function when you realize that a city block can take forever with a 3 or 4 year old child, and likewise people who have mobility challenges, having more seating for people to rest and having water fountains for people to drink from. These are all parts of making it a more welcoming and inclusive environment. And there are plenty of examples around the world of cities of all scales and in all climates of how this works, and it can go wrong. No one's pretending that it can't be done badly, but it's I think where we have landed has been a good compromise in terms of maintaining access for people who currently for whom the current situation works, but also opening up that space to people for whom it currently doesn't, or doesn't as well as it might do.
Did you put that tie on for me out of interest?
No. Did you put that hat on for me?
Absolutely. Hey, if a new mayor was to come in, and I don't want to talk to you about, I haven't said this to anyone about, you're not going to win. I'm not saying that at all. But if a new mayor would come in, could they stop this? Like if there was a mayor out there, and I don't know if there is or isn't, saying we will stop and I'm going to say pedestrianisation of it as we promised, could they actually stop the process?
It would be a very expensive process to
more so to stop it than it would be to continue it on.
Well, you'd be looking at rebuilding the road in terms of the block that is almost finished now, and rebuilding intersections that have been adjusted to cater to the new layout. The rest of the work, we're still digging up the road to replace the water infrastructure for the rest of George Street, and there's still significant cost involved in putting the street back. It's not like that happens for free if you choose to put it back the way that it currently has been. It would be significant cost and further delay to the project if people wanted to effectively start again now that we're this far down the track.
So you're saying that the cost of it and basically the hassle of it to the citizens of Dunedin, ratepayers, or residents, I should say, of Dunedin, would basically mean it can't be turned around.
I think it would be a poor decision to try and do that halfway through this project. It's not impossible, but it would be hugely disruptive and significantly more expensive.
Last question about the area of George Street we're talking about. Is there the businesses that will get impacted whilst the work is going on? Obviously, there will be an impact to that. Do they have the ability to, seek funding or get payments or get some help from council because of the decision that council has made out in front of their businesses? Like, if the streets shut down for time, or the parking between the two things is all gone, do they have any right of recourse for support for what they're losing?
That's not something that we have discussed or that we are offering. The focus has been on doing everything that we can, while acknowledging that it's disruptive, but doing everything that we can to support those businesses and encourage people to keep shopping in the main street while the work is going on, and will continue to do so as that work progresses. But we're not offering financial compensation for the disruption.
I mean, couldn't it be something as simple as, you could give, council could give some kind of rates rebate to the owner of the building, as long as it was passed on to the business? So you wouldn't have to literally hand something out, but if their business has dropped off by 10, 20, 30, 40% during that period, and I'm sure some will, something that's sort of not an actual payment, but as a way to help with their, if we were private, we'd say cost of living, so cost of business expenses. Couldn't something like that be done for them?
The short answer is I don't know how the mechanics of that would work, but it certainly isn't something that we have discussed or entertained up until this point.
All right. Now, you just talked about the cost of that George Street area kind of being switched back to the way it is now, which in that instance would be the other way. Because if it gets done, it's switching it back to the other way, which is how it is now. Does that make sense? So putting it back from the one way back to a two way.
Sure.
Which is interesting, because there's a conversation going on in Dunedin about switching a one way to a two way. And I'm just straight away going, well, all those same things you've just said, which would make that problematic, do they not also apply to this idea of switching the one-way system to a two-way system, the cost and the expense and the hassle? And to be really honest, I've been reading this and looking at this and talking to, I think, your episode number 9, and I still haven't heard a really, really good reason, even for people who are against the idea, as to why we would switch the one-ways into two ways. Now, I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, you are in support of the idea of switching the one ways into two ways. Is that correct, first of all?
I think I think the problem is we haven't had a conversation about what the options actually are.
So you're in support of continuing the conversation, because that was a clarity that was. Now, okay, well, let me ask you something about that, because it seems that's what, now that you've said that, it seems that the criticism that has been labelled at you over that is that you're in support of continuing the conversation around converting it to a two-way, but not about the counter conversation of why it should be left a one-way. If that's correct, or I'm sure there's a bit of spin on there, but explain it all to me, what you have been supportive of. And we're also talking, and as you've already referenced, this has come up a few times before, the conversation where a list of councillors driven, I think, by Jules Radich, put the name of a bunch of other councillors on an email. My understanding is actually without their permission. And I've had, I think Lee Vandervis confirmed that, Carmen Houlihan said that, but then she kind of retracted it. But it seems now what's happened is this group of councillors agreed with what Mr. Radich had said, but didn't technically say, yes, put our name on that email. But after he had put their name on the email, they're saying, yeah, we agree with what he did. So anyway, it's an odd way to do things. But there was a decision made that my understanding is, which means to continue the conversation. That's the decision that's been made. And they weren't happy about an aspect of that. Can you unpack that a little bit for me, please?
I'll try as best as I can to give a short version of how we got to where we got to.
Sure.
So the new Dunedin Hospital was being built in the city centre as per our request, because we need it to be adjacent to the university, and it's a useful economic driver for the city centre to have all of those people working and visiting the city centre. And so as a result of where that ended up being built, Waka Kotahi needed to consider how the state highway functions through the city centre to enable people to be able to access the new Dunedin Hospital when it gets built. And there was a very simplistic, in my view, survey conducted at one point that essentially asked the question in the terms that you have, should it be maintained as it currently is, or should the one-way pairs both be two ways? And people had strong views about that. Just
pause for a second, because you said a very simplistic survey. Was that just like a listener response on the ODT? Where was that survey?
Oh, it was an online feedback.
Okay,
it's called Social Pinpoint.
So unscientific, nothing like that. But it was questioned one way or two ways. Yeah.
It was an opt-in thing for anybody who wanted to give their opinion.
Sure, fine.
And what happened as that work progressed was they came up with alternative ways of laying out the state highway, and one of those is effectively converting one of them to a two-way local road instead of having it as a state highway, and then having in some cases 3 lanes on the eastern side functioning as the state highway.
So closer to the harbour.
Past
the university.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, gotcha.
And so they worked up that option, and those are the two options that have gone through the Waka Kotahi process, and effectively, they came to the conclusion that both of these would work. It really depends on what value you put on various things. If your priority is people being able to travel as fast as possible from one end to the other, then you'd probably pick something closer to what we have now. If you're more interested in supporting safer cycling and a more livable city and a more attractive environment, and having more people be able to access the hospital differently, then you might look at something closer to their new model. And there was a health impact assessment done where they worked with particularly vulnerable groups, so older people, students, staff, people from North Otago, worked through the two options, and the overwhelming majority of people who have been engaged in making a direct comparison between what is on the table have favoured something closer to their alternative option. The problem we have is that we haven't had the opportunity to have that discussion more widely with the general public. The other thing that's important to note is that the status quo isn't an option. So the preference that Waka Kotahi.
So why? Why is that? Why is the status quo not? That's off the table. So you can't keep it as it is. Why?
largely to enable safe access in and out of the hospital. So the preference that Waka Kotahi have yes, it will have 2 lanes of traffic going north, and then somewhere else 2 lanes of traffic going south. But the built environment will change. The speed that people are able to travel through there will change. It will be a slower, safer traffic environment. So I think, and I don't think that's commonly understood. I don't think people understand that. The one option, that there isn't an option that allows things to continue as they currently are.
So let me ask you this, because see, this is why I like having these long form conversations, Aaron, because we can flesh this out. Because I mean, we're basically saying that the hospital is where Cadbury was, yeah.
Part of it is, yeah.
Is that where the emergency? Because my only thing when I heard people talking about this was like, it makes sense to be able to come to, especially the emergency department, from both directions. Whereas you could get that one of 2 ways. You could change the one ways to a 2-way, or you could have access to the emergency department from both sides of the one ways, like either in the north or the south going one ways. Both of those options would suffice that issue. And so my question is basically, and I've asked everybody this and no one's been able to give me an answer yet, maybe you can, is right now, is the emergency department going to be between those one ways, or is it going to be somewhere else? And if it was going to be between one ways, I still don't understand why that can't remain the current option, because you could figure out how to get to the hospital from both ways. It would just be either on the northern one ways or the southern one ways. So hopefully you've got the answers for what's going to be happening there. Maybe you can give them to us.
Certainly. I mean, the current situation is that you have a hospital being built on the median strip of the state highway system, essentially, as it currently is. The conversations we've had with the people who are designing and building it effectively say, I mean, they've said that either one works for them in terms of access to and from the hospital.
So hang on. So either one means it can stay as it is, or it can change. Is that when you say either one, is that what you mean?
Yeah, either the example that is closer to the status quo but not the status quo,
Right.
or the option that is that will convert one of those to a local road and think differently about the state highway. Both of those work from a hospital access point of view.
Right. Okay. Could you just explain again, because maybe I missed it, the status quo, closer to a status quo, how would it change from how it functions right now? The one that's closer to a status quo but not the status quo.
Yeah. So I mean, probably the biggest difference would be the speed at which people could travel through that area, and you change speed you affect people's speed in multiple ways. You can put up a sign that says drive at the speed, or you build the environment in a way that encourages people to behave differently, and both
Like
of those
bars.
build outs or raised tables or whatever the option is. I mean, they're not at detailed design level yet, so I wouldn't know.
With that kind of thing.
But that kind of thing. Yeah.
Is that the only difference? So are you saying that those 2 one ways, the status quo, which is not quite the status quo, is them pretty much as they're functioning now, but different speeds? Is that the only difference?
I think that's the most significant difference, and there would be, there'd be implications for for car parking along there, because you're building the road slightly differently to accommodate that. But it's important because one of the things that we hear the most from people who are, and look, it's understandable that people are anxious about this. It's a significant discussion and a significant decision, but people seem to be labouring under the apprehension that the current time it takes them to get from A to B won't change if we support the direction that it is currently, that Waka Kotahi is currently heading in. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that that is an almost that's not going to be an outcome. This will impact people's the time it takes for people to get from A to B, regardless.
So when you say this will impact, when this in that instance is whatever the changes are will impact.
Whatever the changes are
will
have an implication for how long it takes to get from A to B. Now, there are very few people that do that. So one of the more interesting things that we've found through this process is where people are coming from and where they're going, and the overwhelming traffic flows are people coming from the south and getting to the city centre or to the university, or coming from the north and getting to the university or the city centre, as opposed to going the length of the state highway system. But I guess what the question here is, let's put all the cards on the table and let's look at what the trade-offs are, and let's look at what the pros and cons are of these two options, because we haven't done that yet. And that is something that we want to do with Waka Kotahi in the new year, so that, we are allowing people to participate in a discussion that we haven't let them be part of yet. And relying on the responses to a social media survey about a very different option some time ago isn't that helpful.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. I've made that point several times in these conversations. Those don't mean anything, even though it's a big sample size. The 6,500, voters for the George Street one is not really. It's in the same camp. It's neither here nor there when it comes down to actual research. I believe it was. Is it Mandy Mayhem Bullock? Not the only one, but I talked to her last weekend, and she talked about if we were ultimately trying to get, traffic out of that area, the one-way system, we'd go from the end of the southern motorway somehow up through the hills and just join it onto the northern road somewhere past, Northeast Valley. So actually do a proper bypass. Has that ever been actually talked about with Waka Kotahi or talked about in council that you know of? Actually give us a proper bypass to actually worry about all that heavy traffic, all those trucks, all those people who don't want to stop at the 100 k's an hour. Is it even a possibility? Even if it was a $10 billion cost, is it even a possibility?
I don't know about the engineering possibility of it, but I mean, you raise a good point in that we concentrate on the areas of greatest contention, and that's in this case the state highway, the one-way pair. This is part of a wider program of different transport projects. One of them being the Harbour Arterial, which is exactly designed to do that, to move as much heavy traffic out of that part of the city as possible, so that it can. For its own benefit and for the rest of ours, and other projects to make it easier for people to make more trips differently, so you don't have as much traffic on the road ideally. So that those things need to be considered as a program of work, and thinking about our transport network as a holistic thing, as opposed to picking off individual parts of it and having arguments about those in a vacuum. And certainly there are things that are outside of our control, like we absolutely need to be moving more of our freight on rail and less on the roads for any number of reasons. And so there needs to be a greater degree of advocacy from us to try and affect those outcomes that we're not in complete control of.
Finally, on the system of the one ways becoming two ways, or the one ways becoming the slow one ways, that's what I'll say from now on. Who pays? Who decides? Like, if Waka Kotahi says this is happening, can we decide or not decide or have any input? Who pays? Who decides? And at this stage, do you have a leaning for yourself? Where do you lean towards those options?
The state highway system is paid for by Waka Kotahi, so they will fund.
So no ratepayer in New Zealand in Dunedin will fund a single bit of that change should it happen.
Not of the work itself, no. But certainly, if one of the roads is converted from being a state highway to a local road, as is proposed in one of the options, then we would take on the responsibility for maintaining that over time. But
not building it, not converting it.
The work itself will be funded by Waka Kotahi. It's ultimately a decision for the Waka Kotahi board to make, but they are very conscious of public interest when they're dealing with things as significant as this, and will certainly take the view of council and the view of the community into account when they're making that decision.
And do you have so they decide, but they'll take under consideration what Dunedin says, is what I hear you saying. What about you yourself? Do you have a leaning one way or the other?
At this point, I think the important thing for me is that I will always prioritize decisions where we get the best environmental and the best physical health and well-being outcomes. And I think we need to think far more broadly than we have historically about the role that the transport network can play in that. And so that will always be my preference.
Your default?
I think that is, to me, that is more important than people maybe taking slightly longer to get where they need to go. And that's that was the thrust of Richard Thompson's letter to the newspaper recently. Let's talk about that. Is it 2 minutes? Is it 3 minutes? Is it 20 minutes? What are we asking people to give up, and what are we offering them in return? And until we're able to have that conversation, then I think it's hard for anybody to have a meaning. And I'm not, I'm not across what that means. And that's that's what we want the discussion to look like early in the new year, so that we can have a grown-up conversation about what's at stake and what's on offer, and what the implications are.
And look, people of Dunedin, I mean, you guys should know this by now. I'm sure you do. There's not really a traffic issue in Dunedin. I mean, the worst kind of traffic you'll get is adding 10 minutes to your trip, even if you're going from the furthest point to the furthest point. I mean, I'm visiting Auckland in a couple of... Yeah, well, at like the rush hour in Dunedin is 4:45 until 5:30. It's the rush 45 minutes. I'm in Auckland the first week of October, and I'm going to pick up my father to take him to an appointment. I'm staying in Devonport. He's in Hillsborough. He has to be at his appointment at 9:45. I'll probably be leaving at 7:30 in the morning to get to his place by 9 o'clock, to get back into the traffic to be 5 minutes down the road from him by 9:45. So actually, I'm not minimizing people's, because we become part of our own environment is our yardstick. But actually, really 5-10 minutes anywhere in Dunedin, that's about the most you ever add on, unless there's an extraordinary event like a car accident or a flooding or something like that. So there's not really traffic issues.
And the city is growing, right? Which is a new thing. It hasn't for a long period of time, and now we're in a situation where we've got roughly 1,400 new people coming here. It's the same. It's a greater number of people using the same amount of space. There will always be implications in that for how we move people around.
Although I did have this conversation with another candidate, I'm not sure which one it was, but yes, we're growing, but it's are we really like 0.5% to 1%? Is that much? It's not massive growth. I mean, if that happens every single year for the next 20 years, fair enough. 30% of the population added on is another 40,000 people or so. But no, I hear you, which is why I guess the Three Waters thing, and we're about to get into this conversation about what's happening with our pipes. We need to be, I don't know if there's an official number, maybe you can tell me, but we need to be thinking about what's happening in Dunedin in the year 2150, not in the year 2030, because what's Dunedin going to look like in 2150, and that's what we're going to be thinking about with our pipes today. Do you know, does Three Waters have a target? Are they like, this is the next 100-year plan? Does it have an outlook for what that is?
Well, we're required to have an infrastructure strategy that looks out 30 years. And that's part of our that's
not very much
of our 10-year planning process. And obviously, the further out you get, the harder it is to pin down where you're going to go to. I mean, and population forecasts are a great example of this. Actually, we were involved in arguments with Statistics New Zealand in the not too distant past, who wanted to downgrade the population growth forecasts of Dunedin to negative, i.e., their view was that the population was going to shrink, and so politicians weren't therefore going to invest significantly in growth infrastructure to support a growing population. And then it turns out that we did have a growing population, and so we're kind of playing catch up on that. And that's not a Dunedin problem. That's a national. That's a national issue. But again, even now, we're what they call a medium growth city in the planning speak, and they still think, according to their official forecasting, that will continue for a few years and then will stop. And I can't see a real world scenario where the population here will stop growing. And so one of the difficulties we have is trying to get an accurate handle on what the future state of the city will look like to be able to plan for investment in our long life infrastructure accordingly.
Although one of the problems with Dunedin, being a migrant to this lovely city in the last quarter of my life, is that based on the weather and the housing, that already sort of dictates a lot of the growth, because building in certain areas, like in bigger cities that you can just keep going out and keep on going is one thing, but in Dunedin you notice that it's a very unusual thing for people of Dunedin who don't know this. I don't mean to sound patronizing, but what happens like in Auckland is you have like a suburban crawl, so like we used to live out in West Auckland, and you'd have Titirangi, which was quite an expensive area, and then Glen Eden wasn't, but then people who can't afford to buy in Titirangi bought in Glen Eden, which was one step out. And then there was Swanson, and Swanson was low, and then of course people who couldn't afford to buy in Glen Eden bought in Swanson. So there's this urban crawl, whereas in Dunedin you have Waverley at the top of the hill, very sought after because of the sun at the bottom of the hill, South Dunedin. and there's no crawl between Waverley and South Dunedin because of it's literally because of, in my opinion, because of the weather differences. So I think that will always hinder the growth of Dunedin, because there are going to be some places that never make it an attractive place to build, which is what you need for growth. So the population is already, the population of houses, the number of houses is already reduced, and I don't know if it'll be able to get the same kind of growth as other areas that don't have to think about that kind of thing at all. They're just like, well, okay, you can't do Titirangi, so we'll do Glen Eden. No difference, really. We'll do Swanson. Oh, we can't do Swanson, we'll do Ranui. You know, you just keep on going. Oh, we end up in Helensville, sort of thing. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we're not going to grow, but I think that there are some environmental factors that will hinder the growth here that maybe don't face some other places in New Zealand.
Oh, and certainly the city has been committed to having a compact urban form where possible, and resisting the urban sprawl that we've seen in other places. I mean, it has happened to a degree on the Taieri because flat land is attractive for sure. Developers, but you know, some of that is on soils that probably could be done. More productive uses could be found for, but we can't just keep building out and out and out. Like, you need to build to a greater density and support the compact urban form for any number of reasons, not least of which it's the single biggest contribution town planning can make to the zero carbon transition, because putting people further and further and further out, and then expecting them to travel in and out to their schools or jobs or whatever is a disaster from a planning point of view.
Yeah. All right. This was about Three Waters. I want to get some clarity from you as to where you are on this, because I went through a few, like over the last 12 months, actually went through finding out more about what your thoughts were around Three Waters. And easiest thing to clear it up, because in August of last year, you presented Council's Three Waters submission. I think it's a year or 12 months ago. You wrote a piece. I think this is your piece, isn't it? Your opinion piece in September of last year, where you said, we want to talk to our community about the government's proposals, and you'll hear more from us on this in the coming weeks. However, there are still too many unknowns to be able to do that properly. With mayors across Otago and Southland, I've asked the government to slow down the process and allow time for meaningful public engagement. After all, this is the biggest proposed change to the form and function of councils in more than 30 years. The very least that councils and community deserve is time to get behind it. It was then listed that in October of 2021, you were opposing the Three Waters reform. But then when there was a vote in Parliament, February of 2022 Council, apologies. I didn't mean to release your secret there, Aaron. In council, about joining this, group of councils to oppose it officially, you voted against that. Now, I know there's some reasons for that about what that meant for the council. So I'm not saying there's a mixed message, like you're flip-flopping or anything, but it's just unclear for me where you are exactly on Three Waters, what you think should happen, what you are supporting. So the floor is yours, sir. Let me know.
Yeah, thanks. So the high level objectives of the reform program I support and council support, and that is better health outcomes, better environmental outcomes, a stronger role for iwi Māori in the system. We're not convinced, and I'm not convinced, that the model that is currently proposed by government is the best way of achieving that. And there hasn't been any argument made or any votes at council in support of the government's reform program. We have had concerns about what this means all the way through, and have expressed those in the forums that we've had available, and continue to do that as we learn more about what we're facing, and therefore can have a more informed view as to the different parts of it. But there are significant issues for us in terms of things like civil defence management, and what happens in a heavy rain event when we are no longer in direct control, or we can't direct staff at the pumping station in the way that we currently do, because they are our staff. And what does this mean for the planning system? Do you end up in a situation where you have to allow for residential development where a water services entity wants to put pipes in the ground, as opposed to where it might make most sense from a planning point of view to do that? How are these things going to be funded from a charging and financing point of view? All of these things are still unknown, and the whole thing is really an exercise in shadow boxing, because we just don't know. But I think there are there are those who will try and argue that by choosing to not align ourselves with a protest group that is tacit endorsement or overt endorsement of the government's reform program, I think that's what's untrue and unhelpful for people to be promulgating that. We've certainly been very clear at council at every stage that this isn't how we see our communities being best served by what the government's proposing.
Yeah, and I was going to look up just to give people an example if they haven't seen it. But so one of the issues that seemed to have for some of the people who voted against joining was the cost would be $20,000 to join the group. Funds would have to come from the existing Three Waters budget. That was a concern why people didn't want to join it. Also, that there was going to be a voting system where everyone got one vote. So if we signed up with somewhere, and I don't actually. Doesn't matter where they did or didn't, but somewhere like Clutha, with a much smaller population, with a much different situation with their Three Waters, they would have an equal voting right as Dunedin, which is a very different city with a lot more people. So there were people who were not supporting that group, as you say, not as a tacit endorsement of the government's position, but because that still didn't provide for them, these councillors, what they thought it needed to keep for the best for Dunedin, basically.
Why would we surrender our campaign strategy or our advocacy strategy to a group of other councils? And that's effectively what we would have been. It's what you're asked to sign up for when you join the group. They will make collective.
But isn't that exactly the same argument as Three Waters? Like, rather than giving it to other councils, you're giving it to a centralised group. Why would you do that?
No, I don't think how you plan infrastructure and how you organize a campaign are analogous. I think we were in a situation where by joining a protest group, that would essentially, that group of which we would be one voice when they were making decisions, would then dictate the approach we took to engaging with government on Three Waters reform. And I can't see how our community would be best served by us handing over control of that to a group of other councils.
So what I guess I'm saying is one of the criticisms with Three Waters seems to be by many that we're giving over our control of services to a centralised group, as opposed to you're saying we don't want to give it to other councils, this control and the vote, and other people are saying we don't want to give it to central government. And one of the things people are saying are 12 votes for the Southern Island proportion of Three Waters, of which 6 are iwi and 6 are then spread through the rest of the current councils. How would we may not even get representation on there, or if we do, it might be one person, 1 out of 12, same thing, isn't it? How are we going to therefore protect our own interests, you haven't used these words, in that group, as well as if we were part of the protest group? We're giving power away. Either way, we're giving power to another group over our waters.
Yes, but one is still a hypothetical future state at this point, as opposed to what we do in the here and now to try and influence the outcome of what the future state might look like. And certainly, that's a valid concern. And one of the things that's most appealing to us about an Otago Southland arrangement, for example, is that, and I think they allow for up to 14 members on the representation group. There would be then room for, I think there are 15 local councils and Papatipu Runanga in the Otago Southland region. So, effectively all of those would be represented at the governance level in a way that it certainly won't be the case across the entire Ngāi Tahu.
But still, let's say Gore has one person on that new entity that you've just talked about. That means the people of Gore are still giving away the power for decision making, because of the majority are not Gore, to other people. So if that's the big concern, if the big concern is giving power and decision making away, I mean, I would suspect if that's the concern for someone not joining a group, then they'll never join Three Waters, because that's exactly what happens within that. That's the exact concern of what will happen in that situation here in the South Island. Head office, quote unquote, head office will probably be being Christchurch, the biggest centre. And this is the concern that all the candidates have been saying to me. Why do we want people in Christchurch to be that of which we're 1 out of 12 to make decisions for what's happening in Dunedin? That's the exact concern of Three Waters. And it would be the same concern whether it was a centralised group or whether it was a smaller Otago Southland group. Dunedin would be the powerhouse in that situation, and it should be the same concern for the Invercargills or the Cluthas or the Bell Cluthas or the Gores, because then Dunedin's in charge of what happens in their situation. So it's like there's a philosophical part of this, Aaron, which I'd like you to take on as well, which I've talked to everyone about. And I would assume, based on your politics, that you would you would like the idea of we're only as strongest as our weakest link. And on some level for Three Waters, if Clutha is the weakest link, then actually the stronger links can only be as strong as that weakest link. Because although they're over there and there's an imaginary line drawn on a piece of paper that says not us, actually what happens to them, if it's flooding, if it's damage, if it's whatever, can impact us because we have a relationship with them. People in Dunedin have places in that area. You know, even though they're different, they're the same. And to put my cards on the table, I'm not necessarily in for Three Waters either. I'm just looking at the overall picture and trying to work this out, and mostly trying to work out where you guys are, because you're the candidates that are telling people about this. And if you follow the philosophy of we're only as strong as our weakest link, then you should be in for Three Waters. If you don't, then you face the problem also that if, for example, Blueskin Bay needs pipes, then the rest of Dunedin is going to support them. That's just a smaller example of the weakest link needing help than the bigger example of Clutha needing help from Otago. So there's some philosophical things here as well, which I think is worthy of talking about, to talk about who you are as a person and how that works. I've talked a lot. How about you answer?
I mean, we call that cross-subsidisation. And we do that, like you say, we do that within the city all the time. You know, we don't, when they put in the water infrastructure on the peninsula, there was an argument at that point as to whether or not only the people who lived on the peninsula should pay for it.
In the 90s,
council decided that that's ridiculous. We will all pay for it because, you know, that's what it means to operate collectively as a city. And this, to some degree, what's being proposed is just that on a grander scale. And we do need to accept that, you know, that will come. There will be winners and losers always when you're dealing with cross-subsidisation. And we have, by any of the analysis that has been done, you know, the least to gain from a model like that. That in and of itself, I don't think is a reason not to do it. And certainly there are particularly smaller councils who will struggle to have the capacity to maintain a network, and not just, you know, a lot of the focus is on drinking water and wastewater systems, but stormwater as well in a changing climate where you're going to have increasing capacity demands on your stormwater network. You know, whether Waipa District Council or Ruapehu District Council or Clutha District Council have the capacity to deliver that on their own, probably not. And so what is the best model then of making sure that wherever you are in the country, you are adequately served by your water network? And some will argue that the government should just give them money to let them do it themselves, or try and operate something like the Wakakotahi model, where, you know, they co-fund half of our transport projects. The government have put this up as their way of trying to fix the problem. And I think there are plenty of legitimate arguments to be made against what is being proposed. I think the fact that we might have to pay a bit of money for other people who can't afford to pay a bit of money is not one of the stronger ones.
Just coming back to the point we started this chat with, the second part of this chat, about, it would seem to me that if your concern is you yourself, but also others, your concern is you're giving away power to people outside of Dunedin to make decisions for people inside Dunedin. If that's the concern, that person with that concern could never support Three Waters. Would that be a fair summary? Because either way, you're giving away power of decision making to outside of Dunedin, whether it's in Christchurch, whether it's in Wellington, or whatever.
I think it depends on how a lot of time gets taken up talking about it's called the regional representative group in the proposed model, and that's it's a convoluted organizational structure, what is being proposed. But that group, the job of that group is to set up a process for appointing the board and to deliver statements of intent to that board. That board then appoint a chief executive, and then they run the entity. It's not a group that would have significant influence over the day-to-day operation of the water services entity. And so, but I guess, I don't know. I don't think it's impossible to come up with a governance model at a regional scale that can avoid those sorts of hazards, or could mitigate the
Really?
risks or appease the concerns that people have.
I mean, the only way you can appease it, I mean, you've just talked about it, about opening up the floodgates on whatever area you talked about doing. The only way you could appease that is to basically keep it similar to model to what we've got right and have the control of that right here. But then if you're going to keep that control right here, then what's the point in going with the centralized version? Again, I'll say, if that's your concern, if it's that not you, but anyone, if it's about control, local control, then surely 3 waters can't work. That seems to be a logical conclusion, that if you're not prepared to give up local control, then no one's prepared to be a part of 3 waters.
I think it's a question of scale as much as anything. And council's position is that we could stomach it at an Otago Southland level, and we have strong working relationships with our colleagues across Otago and Southland anyway. The South, well, it's not the Takiwā wide model, which is what is being proposed, is a bridge too far in terms of taking. It's that much more removed from us in terms of the sheer scale of it, and as you say, the ability that we would have to have any input into governance level decisions.
You said that the very first thing you said about 3 waters was you kind of support the overall idea of it, which is better health outcomes. You then went on to say that this is not necessarily the best way to do that. Let's say 3 waters goes, and it's disappeared, and then we're left as a council, you as the mayor, and you are looking for those better health outcomes. What do you think is the way to achieve that then, if this is not necessarily the model?
In terms of the water network?
Yep, like whatever. We're talking about 3 waters. You said you support really the overall idea, and you talked about better health outcomes. And then you said that this is maybe not necessarily the way to get there. So how is the way to get there? Like if 3 waters wasn't there, how do we get to those better health outcomes with our waters multiple?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, I mean, Taumata Arawai has stood up now as a drinking water regulator. One of the things that we've had, one of the biggest issues we've had is that we haven't had any effective regulation of drinking water. It sat within the Ministry of Health. They did nothing. And we've had really poor outcomes as a result of that. We now have a drinking water regulator that will be more actively involved in their work, and that will drive better performance and better investment in the water network, because people won't have the option. Once the drinking, from a health outcomes point of view, I think the drinking water regulator is a significant part of achieving that. That's separate to a question about how do you set up local government to enable them to be able to make the required investment to meet those standards. That's a different question.
Mm-hmm.
And we are saying that there probably is a merit in some kind of agglomeration, but we think that doing something closer to where we are, doing something regionally across Otago and Southland, is a compromise really in terms of the benefits that might be gained across the region versus the costs of losing direct control and influence over your water network.
So you can see the advantage of being part of a bigger group, but there's going to be a tipping point where being part of a humongous group, the advantage may tip to being not quite as obvious. But a bigger group, for example, purchasing power, contracts, that kind of stuff, there's an advantage to. If you can buy 1 million widgets, you're going to get them for significantly cheaper than 10,000 widgets. There's an advantage there. But there's almost a reverse economies of scale. If you've got too big, then who's looking after our water? That's the concern.
Yeah, as long as you acknowledge that the benefits will sit on a spectrum for different councils within that region, and I acknowledge that. Right. We are at one end of that spectrum. We have the least to gain.
Yeah, because our 3 waters is good. I mean, my understanding, and I've talked to people off the record, but who know, they all say our drinking water is pretty good, our wastewater is pretty good, our stormwater needs work. Is that a fair assumption? Or a fair analysis?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think historically we haven't prioritized investing in our water network as much as we needed to. I mean, we've got so our current 10-year plan. I've got a $1.5 billion capital work program. Close to $1 billion of that is fixing our aging infrastructure, both our water network and our in our roads. We are playing catch up, absolutely, from decisions that have been made historically and investment that hasn't been made in the system. So we haven't always been showered ourselves in glory, shall we say, when it comes to this. But I think we're doing a good job of remedying that and accelerating our investment into fixing it.
And we're showering ourselves in glory with better water. It's a nice kind of summary there, Aaron. It's just you shower and water. Anyway, hey, I'm sitting here thinking and listening to what you're saying. I think you are at a disadvantage in one area, because I feel a little bit like the conversations going on between government and opposition at the moment. You're sort of the government figure. In other words, you're the incumbent. Yeah. The opposition at the moment, the National Party, ACT, whoever it is, they're able to say whatever the hell they want, because they don't have to be held to account to it. So they basically just point at the other people and point at, like I've been saying for a long time, Christopher Luxon's thing is not saying we're so good you should hire us, because they're saying they're so bad you should get rid of them. And as I stand here and listen to you, I'm sitting, I hear you on Three Waters and I hear you on Waka Kotahi, and it seems like what you're saying is, well, I don't know yet because we don't have the information. So as the mayor, you're sitting going, well, it's almost like you're saying, well, I'll answer that question for you when we have the information to know how to answer that question for you. Whereas the opposition, your challengers, can go, two ways. Keep it one way, must keep one way. Don't change it 2 ways. It's going to be a nightmare. Three, so they're able to just make claims without the information, whereas you seem to be sitting waiting for the information. I don't know whether that's an official thing that the mayor needs to do, like to not go out and make broad sweeping statements.
I think it's the responsible thing to do. Okay,
fair enough. So how do you get your message across to people to go, this thing about other than fantastic places like this, like the one-way, two-way conversation, where you need to spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes unpacking it sometimes to go, guys, we don't have the information yet. Ultimately, it's up to Waka Kotahi. Like, this is the first time I'm saying that status quo is not an option. It's the first time I've heard it. Right. How do you, what do you face getting your message out there versus the other people that can just, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, can just blurt out whatever they want and that be a headline in the ODT?
I mean, there's nothing more seductive than a simple solution to a complex problem, right? And so that's an easy message to sell, regardless of how connected it might be to the reality of the situation in that we operate. And I think the message really is that, we should make our decisions with the best information that we have, and have those conversations openly with our community about what the different options are and what the different trade-offs are. And that doesn't matter whether it's a conversation about waste or a conversation about transport or a conversation about building new pools or libraries or playgrounds. This is what people should expect of their elected leadership, is the capacity to take on board the information that we are presented, and to weigh up the competing options and the trade-offs, and then ultimately make decisions in the best interest of the wider community. And that's a really hard thing to put it as a slogan on a billboard, but it is absolutely the job of us as governors to it's a really long.
I'm just thinking of the bumper sticker. It's going to be the whole bumper.
So what does Keep Three Waters mean? I mean, what does that mean as a campaign slogan? And that's a really easy thing to say. It's not a decision that council will make. It's a declaration of intent. I totally get that, but it doesn't operate within the reality of our political context.
But the irony being, Aaron, to be honest, and maybe this is my bad, my expectation was there'd be a very different vibe for Three Waters. You're not saying anything that dissimilar to any of the other candidates. The only difference is you're not sitting in a position to make the absolute, black and white conversation. You're saying this is what's going on and we need to get all the information. Whereas the other people are going, this is what's going on, and then this is the decision. That seems to be the difference. Like maybe it's my bias, Aaron, but I thought, you'd be fully in to Three Waters. I'm like, yep, all in, Green Party, let's get into it. But I don't think anyone that I've spoken to has been pro the current situation, and you're one of the people that's not pro the current proposal. So I'm like, what's all the hubbub about?
We agree on. I mean, this is for all of the noise around this debate, right? And the public discourse has been ugly, and it's been enabled, I think, by a vacuum of governments enabled that to take over and be ugly. But at council, we broadly agree collectively as to where we stand on Three Waters. The difference of opinion is mostly around our strategy for how you might influence change. And my view has always been that we're better off to operate constructively and work with government and try and shape the proposals as best we can, as opposed to pretending that this isn't happening, burying our head in the sand and getting angry about it, and just hoping for a different outcome, because that doesn't work in this context. And I know that people will see that as acquiescence or tacit support, but it certainly isn't. It just isn't the case. I mean, nobody has argued at council in any number of forums in support of what is going on. But we have had the biggest debates we've had are around how we go about trying to make ourselves heard in that discussion.
Tell me one thing you appreciate about Lee Vandervis.
He's a fantastic orator, and one of the strongest debaters I've ever seen in a political environment.
Formidable?
Can be, yeah.
I'd like to know as well. I'm going to finish up with some questions with you, which are a bit different, because they're all like, well, if you were mayor, what would you do? Well, you are mayor. But one of the things I've heard some ideas from some of the other councillors in particular, like Lee Vandervis talking about using referendum more to find out the feeling of the population. I think Jules Radish had an idea for a recycling thing, which seemed to be a bit different, his little kind of quirky thing. Have you heard anything from the other councillors through this process, or from the other candidates through this process, that might not have been your thing to kind of push, but you've gone, if I was mayor, that would be quite a good idea to look at? Like, has anyone else, have any ideas come from the other candidates that you've heard that you've quite liked?
I think there's certainly a need for, and this is, I don't think this is the exact example, but there's certainly a need for greater onshore recycling capacity in the country. I mean, nobody does plastics recycling in New Zealand. It all gets exported somewhere. And so I think, there'll be different views probably as to what that might look like. But I think there's certainly merit in looking at, how we best provide for dealing with our own recycling and waste streams here in New Zealand, as opposed to exporting everything to somewhere that will buy it.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely worth considering as part of our wider, Waste Futures program.
On Facebook, Peter Burrows asks about the growth of our city. Leslie McLaughlin asks about your leadership and what you have achieved. I guess I'm going to wrap up by giving you a slightly different question from everyone else, because you are the mayor, but it kind of ties into a couple of those questions, which is just simply, what is your vision for the city moving forward? What do you want to help turn Dunedin into, Aaron, should you be re-elected?
Well, I'm proud, first of all, to live in a city that is heading in such a positive direction, and to have led a council that is getting on with getting things done in our community, which is, fixing our aging infrastructure, long overdue upgrades to our pools and our playgrounds and our public spaces, and thinking of the future, tackling the causes and effects of climate change head on, building a 21st century transport network, planning for a growing city, and doing that in a way that makes good on our commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi. And it's not about what my grand vision is or my grand plan is. It's, we have those conversations with our community, and we did that through the last 10-year plan process, and this is the program of work that came out of that. And my focus is on delivering the work that we have committed to doing, as opposed to trying to build any legacy for the current council. We're just getting on with doing the work.
All right. Anything else you want to add before we're going to go for 90 minutes? You've got 90 seconds, technically. Anything else you want to add before we head off, Aaron? Thank you for joining us, by the way.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. No, nothing really from me. I mean, I think it's been a privilege to have served as mayor for the last 3 years, and I welcome people's support for that, and to be able to continue to build on the momentum that the city has, continue to build leadership around climate action, and to continue to build our relationship with mana whenua and what that means in a 21st century context. It's a really exciting time here in the city. I can't remember a point at which Dunedin has been as confident about itself as it is now, and our job is to to take the billions of dollars that's being invested into the city over the next 10 years and beyond, and use that opportunity to set us up for future generations. And I would welcome the opportunity to continue to play my part in that as your next mayor.
Aaron Hawkins, candidate and incumbent for Dunedin City Mayor. Thanks for joining us today, Aaron. Appreciate your time, and all the best in the run up to Election Day.
Kia ora, Pat.